2024. My gosh, it is the final day of the year, and it is great, as always, to be with you. You know, I look back at this year, and it was... It was a doozy of a year in more ways than one. Obviously, the big one was what happened in November with our dear friend Dennis. But personally and professionally, I know for me, it was quite a doozy. And I would be very curious to hear from you how you would assess this past year. We all have high years and low years and years that are somewhere in the middle. This one, as far as global affairs goes, was quite sensational. I wonder, though, was there any year on the books that was kind of boring? Could you say of any year that something sensational didn't really happen, or it was a kind of uneventful year? I think every single year we would characterize as sensational. I often, when we go into the new year, I don't know about you, but I tend to think, how long will it last until something huge happens? Is it going to be December or January 1st? Is it going to be the 5th? Is it going to wait until February? I kind of am always seeing how far can we get into this year before something really captures our attention that will be always remembered as an event that occurred in that time and place. Forgive me for getting a little distracted. Yes, Sean, my producer cutting in.
I just realized that you did the 2024 predictions episode. We should go back and see if you got anything right.
Yes, could you look up my predictions right now? I think I sent them to you in my notes.
Now? Can't we send it till next year?
No. Yeah. While I'm talking. Well, that's an excellent idea. I do remember one of them was that John Fetterman would become a star in the Democratic Party and that he would surprise us with his common sense. And I think that's been true with his stances on immigration, his stances on Israel. My dad actually met him recently. He was in Hanover, New Hampshire, of all places, in a hotel lobby. And my dad ran into him and took a picture with him. And here John Fetterman is a giant over my 6-foot-tall dad. But, you know, if we look at some of the things that happened in the past year, my gosh, I was compiling a list and even I did not realize how, to use the word of the day, apparently, sensational 2024 was. Claudine Gay resigned as the president of Harvard University earlier this year, and then penned an op-ed in the New York Times saying that she was a victim of discrimination and of ideologues who were pushing her out to prove a point. Of course, she didn't accept responsibility for her disastrous congressional testimony and plagiarism, or as she would call it, duplication of language. That all happened this year. Other thing that happened this year was, of course, in conjunction with the resignation of President Gay, or as we called her at Harvard, President Bisexual. We called her Claudine Bisexual, my friends and I. Whoops, so bad. So terrible of us. Another thing that happened was, those horrible Palestine protests, the Gaza Solidarity encampments. I remember videos from Harvard University in the yard, people tearing apart that yard, running around. I mean, it wasn't just at my alma mater, it was everywhere across the country. Universities had these protests or these defiance of laws. I went in April of this year to Columbia University to cover the Gaza Solidarity encampments at Columbia. And when I was there, that's when the students occupied Hamilton Hall. And in 1968-esque videos, police had to go in and extract students and arrest them from occupying and breaching administrative buildings. And I remember being there on the sidewalk right outside of Columbia University on, Broadway and 110th Street or something. And there were literally like 10 huge buses of NYPD officers. You could not go inside the main quad of Columbia without a swipe. And even more startling was that there were these groups of people congregating on the sidewalk outside of Columbia. And some of them, one was a group of Orthodox Jews who was calling for the eradication of the state of Israel. And I was looking at these 4 to 5-year-old young Orthodox Jewish boys who were yelling, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism and Israel's committing a Holocaust. It was so crazy for me to see these poor young children who shouldn't even know any of these words. They should be out playing. And they were outside of Columbia. There was a group of Muslim individuals who were praying, and students would walk by in keffiyehs and give thumbs up to the posters that these individuals were holding up. And then there were these kind of like oppositional groups. There were a lot of journalists, but there were these people that were pro-Israel advocates who were also fighting the anti-Israel people on the sidewalk. There was also this strange fellow, to put it mildly, who was holding a sign that said Jews equals Nazis. And I just remember pausing there on the sidewalk and being like, I need a martini, stat. In fact, I need a martini intravenously provided immediately, because this is some crazy stuff. It was like being in the Twilight Zone. And I just had this moment where I went, how did these once great universities, which were the bragging rights of American leaders and American citizens, become these breeding grounds for radical, bizarre, I don't know, conventions? It was crazy. So that was this year. Speaking of Israel, the Hezbollah pager attack was this year, which will go down in history as the most probably surprising, brilliant, and efficient military operations ever. Hassan Nasrallah was killed. Sinwar was killed, the leader of Hamas. It was really, really amazing in that regard. Also, Bashar al-Assad's regime fell after 50 years of the Assad's family brutal dictatorship in Syria. They fled to Russia. Speaking of Russia, that's when Evan Gershkovich, as well as some other Americans held captive in Russia, they were released this year. Ukraine invaded Russia this year. They went, as we've talked about, into the Kursk region of Russia and fired conventional weapons into that town. And that was the first time that there was an incursion in the interior of Russia since World War II. And in turn, President Vladimir Putin said that this would constitute, if the United States aided Ukraine and gave them more weapons to continue to do this, it would constitute an act of war on Russia by the US and NATO. And Navalny, thank you, Sean. Oh, that's right. Alexei Navalny was killed this year. My gosh, the list continues. Of course, Trump was convicted on all 34 counts of a bogus sham legal case. He also had an attempt on his life on July 13th at the Butler, Pennsylvania rally. I believe that video is footage, real life footage of God performing a miracle. Shortly after that, President Biden resigned. I mean, talk about intravenously provided martinis. This was quite a year. Biden pardoned his son. Dennis Prager took a terrible fall. This was a doozy of a year. If I'm forgetting any, I highly encourage you to write in the chat or email me with some of the other big moments of 2024.
Well, Michael B. in the chat has the definition for doozy. Unusual, special, extraordinary, one of its kind.
Thank you, Michael, in the chat. I was waiting for that anxiously. No, seriously, that's very, very helpful to know. Thank you. All right, so let's go on do some news. And then I want to do about 10 to 15 minutes on President Jimmy Carter. We acknowledged this briefly yesterday with my guest, Daniel Greenfield, but of course, the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, died at the age of 100 on Sunday. And I have a really good segment for you about his personal and professional legacy. But first, to really discuss a topic that we cover, probably almost bi-weekly on this show. Another China hack has come to the United States. So you wonder, when will it be enough? And, speaking of China, President Jimmy Carter was the first president to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China, as opposed to the Nationalist Party, which went with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. That was a mistake. But according to the Daily Wire and many other news outlets, the Treasury Department revealed yesterday that Chinese hackers breached its system in a, quote, major cyber security incident. Continuing to read from the Daily Wire, the hackers accessed unclassified documents and employee workstations. The department believed a Chinese intelligence agency was behind the breach. Now, one would have very good grounds to speculate that in any event, because the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated a real superiority in terms of their electronic capabilities. They are fantastic computer programmers, computer breachers. They are really spectacular in that category. Also, though, there has been evidence that time and time again, the Chinese Communist Party has endeavored and has successfully breached the classified data of Americans and American diplomats. For instance, earlier this year, an operation stole the emails of State Department employees. And also earlier this year, China was believed to have hacked several major American telecommunication companies. In addition to that, our FBI director, Christopher Wray, also said in 2024, just to add on to all of the big events of this year, that China's effort to implant malware in U.S. critical infrastructure was occurring, quote, at a rate greater than we had seen. So China has its fingerprints on a lot of hacking mechanisms, and this appears to be no different. According to the Daily Wire, the Treasury Department was first notified of that breach on December 8th by a third-party software service, Beyond Trust, that, quote, a threat actor had gained access to a key used by the vendor to secure a cloud-based service used to remotely provide technical support to Treasury Department offices and users. You know, this is a real problem of the magnificent 21st century system that we have, where a lot of our infrastructure is A, electronic, B, interconnected, and C, can be accessed and in turn disabled remotely. And so that's exactly what appears to have happened here. A cloud-based service remotely used to provide technical support was accessed and breached. This allowed the hackers, again, continuing to read from the Daily Wire. I have been so intent this year, you've probably noticed it in every single episode, on citing scrupulously and perhaps ad nauseum what source I am reading from because of the Claudine Gay scandal. But the DW says that this allowed hackers to override security and gain access to Treasury Department employee workstations and the classified documents that were stored on them. So they have come out and said that they believe, they meaning the Treasury Department, believes this to have been a China state-sponsored actor. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party, in due fashion, has denied that they were behind it. According to the Chinese Communist Party spokesperson for the State Department there, quote, "We have repeatedly stated our position on such groundless accusations that lack evidence. We are not behind this," they say. China consistently opposes all forms of hacking, and we are even more opposed to the dissemination of false information against China for political purposes. This is just giving us such a deja vu. I mean, time and time again, when I report on these stories, it's the same thing. It's a hack. It's remotely carried out. The U.S. government suspects that it's China, and China accuses the U.S. government of political malfeasance. The more things seem to change, the more they stay the same. You know, speaking of... I'm trying so hard to find a good segue here. Speaking of change, you may need to change your pillows. That's pretty good. Pretty damn good. That went from being like a 0 out of 10 to maybe a 4 out of 10. You may need to change your pillows and your bed sheets and your duvets and your down comforters and your towels and all the damn things you use. And you can do that by going to mypillow.com and using the promo code Hartman. You can get big discounts on many MyPillow products as part of their ever continuing Christmas extravaganza. Their famous My Slippers, which haven't been on sale for over a year, are regularly priced at $119.98. But for a limited time, they are available at nearly half that price at only $59.98. Their 6-piece towel sets are also back in stock with extremely limited quantities for only $29.98. You can go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. And you know, on top of this, they're extending their 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, 2025. All orders over $75 ship absolutely free. Again, go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman. let's move on now to a discussion of President Carter, who, as I had indicated earlier, died at the age of 100 just a few days ago. He was born in 1924 and died in 2024. Isn't that amazing? May we all live such a long life. President Carter, as we know, is the 39th president of the United States, and I want to go through and assess some of the most pertinent parts of his presidency, which was largely an unsuccessful one that is not regarded, at least so far in the span of history, as one characterized by much success. That being said, he was an incredibly decent man, perhaps the most decent man to hold public office in the past 100 years. He was a family man, married to his wife, Rosalind Carter, for, 7 decades? I think they were the 77 years. They were the longest married couple as far as presidential couples go. Here's a little background on Jimmy Carter's upbringing. He was born, as I said, in 1924 in Plains, Georgia, and he was the son of a farmer and of a nurse. And he picked cotton and picked peanuts on his father's farm. He was a peanut farmer, and we have a photo of him here, of him on the peanut farm. He, growing up in Georgia, attended a segregated school. And then he enrolled in the U.S. Naval Academy, and he graduated from there just after the end of World War II in 1946. He was extremely skilled at nuclear physics, and when he went on to graduate from the Naval Academy, he actually worked for the United States Navy, and he helped design some of our nuclear power submarines. And he was highly valued in ascending the ranks in the Navy. But then in 1953, his father died, and he went back to the farm in Georgia in order to help the peanut business and to care for his family. He then went on to have a career in politics. He joined the Georgia State Senate, and he actually showed that his opponent was guilty of voter fraud when he was running for state senate. Then he went on to become the governor of Georgia, and he was elected president in 1976. In 1976, he defeated the Republican incumbent Gerald Ford by about 1%. It was a really, really close election. And President Ford, as we know, was the only U.S. president to date who was not elected as president. He took over the office when his president, Richard Nixon, resigned. He was the VP under Nixon and then became the president. So that contributed to the fact that Jimmy Carter defeated him. Also, Gerald Ford had some Joe Biden-esque moments. There were images of him falling down the stairs, running up to Air Force One. He also had some similar blunders as to our current president, Joe Biden. And so anyway, that's just to say that President Carter won over Gerald Ford in 1976. He married Rosalind Carter much earlier in 1946, the year that he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. They were actually neighbors and classmates in Georgia and became elementary and high school sweethearts, and then later husband and wife. And they had 4 children. We have a photo of them here: Amy, Jack, Donald, and James. Amy there is the cute girl with the bangs. And I was watching an interview of her just a few days ago, and she was talking about how a lot of the photos of her growing up in the White House that were publicized made her look kind of down. She always seemed a little perturbed or a little bit upset in those photos. This photo that I showed you was an exception, but she said, "I had a great time. What wasn't to love about living in the White House?" And her father was really known, despite his unfortunate slew of policies as president, he was really known as being an incredibly decent and unpretentious family man. He was just an ordinary Christian farmer That was a huge part of his campaign. He really positioned himself as a regular guy, the quintessential American. He wore jeans. He even wore cardigans, which many actually deemed to be kind of bizarre as president. We have a photo there of Jimmy Carter in his cardigans. He would also carry luggage on his own. There were these videos of him. Unfortunately, we don't have one here, but he would exit Air Force One and he would carry his own luggage, and you could see the presidential butlers and handlers kind of swatting him, going, "Please, President Carter, let me carry your luggage." But he wanted to show that he was one of the people, and he just generally gave a anti-swamp vibe. He really established himself as an everyday person, and that, I think, is something that we all should admire and appreciate about President Carter. You know, there's a really sweet video of him in 2017 boarding a Delta flight, and he went through the rows and shook the hands of every single passenger on that flight.
He must not have known about COVID. I'm just stalling for time as he gets the video.
Well, that was 3 years before COVID.
I know. I'm just saying.
Great stalling. Almost as good as my pillow transition.
Electronic devices do need to be put into the airplane mode for the duration of the flight, although you're more than welcome to use those devices for the entire flight, as long as they do stay in the airplane mode. Before the aircraft moves today, everyone must be seated, seatbelt fastened, tray tables, carry-on items loaded, and
That was nice. You heard that woman say, "I love you, Jimmy Carter." Well, let's move on to talk about some parts of his presidency policy-wise. We've established that he was a totally decent man, but not so much of a great president. You know, to start off, I guess, with something positive, one of the things that perhaps has aged the best as a act in the Carter administration was the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act. The U.S. government used to have the ability to tell airlines where they could fly and how much they could charge and what their schedules would be. And this was good in a lot of ways because it enabled smaller airports and smaller airlines to operate. Now, with our big airlines and our big airports, their flight patterns are usually from one huge airport to another. But it used to be the case, I take it at the American people's word, given that I was not even a thought at the time of this act being passed, that you could go to Worcester, Massachusetts, and fly out of Worcester, Massachusetts, and go to Spokane, Washington, on some little-known airline to some smaller-known airport. And so Carter, and then his what's the opposite of predecessor, his successor, Reagan, continued this aggressive deregulation of airlines. And it lowered airfare, but it got rid of those smaller airlines and those other routes. And crucially, what it did was it actually just made airlines a lot less of a pleasant experience. Dennis Prager, my dear, dear friend and co-host, would talk all the time on Dennis and Julie about how luxurious flying used to be. He used to have these lovely leather seats, and the meals were not terrible, and people dressed well, and it was generally a good experience. But with the deregulation, of course, these airlines want to slash costs as much as possible. So that's in part why all of us are treated like sardines. But this kind of indicates, I guess, what one would consider to be a bad part of free markets, that there are not any small airlines anymore or small bookstores. It has this way maybe of cutting costs, but of making large companies triumph over the smaller ones. But still, that is generally, certainly compared to his other policies, looked back on as something that was positive. Let's go to the more unfortunate ones. And the big one that will always be associated with Carter's presidency was the toppling of Iran, the 1979 revolution. As we've talked about on this show, in 1953, the United States helped to oust Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran, democratically elected by the Iranian people. And he was a socialist. He was hostile to America. And we, the United States, helped to oust him in 1953 and install the Shah. The Shah was a very pro-Western, very pro-American, forward-looking person. And Dennis, to mention him another time, said that he flew to Tehran. He said, my gosh, I wish I had kept that ticket. Dennis Prager flying to Tehran. And he said it was so liberal, it was so free and open, and women could wear their hair however they liked and dress however they liked. But Iran has a large Sunni fundamentalist population. It is also situated in a neighborhood that is incredibly Muslim. And so many Shiite individuals and fundamentalists resented the Shah for being a puppet of the Americans and supported by the Americans and favoring the policies of the Americans. President Carter started his presidency off by supporting the Shah. But then, sort of towards the end of his presidency, many say that he turned his back on the Shah. And he did this in two ways. The first is that he did not want the Shah to crack down on the protests that were happening in Iran. There were a lot of Shiites who would go to the streets and protest the Shah, and they would raise hell. I mean, they would loot businesses, they would, throw firecrackers. Like they were really disrupting the law and order of Iran. These were not, March on Washington kind of protesters. And Carter would say to the Shah, be nice, don't do anything. And that would in turn embolden these Shiite revolutionaries even more. And then another bad thing was that in 1978, Carter gave a kind of statement that indicated that his support for the Shah was not as strong as it once was. He said something like, well, the Iranian people have to decide if this is what they want going forward, or he criticized the Shah, and that was seen as a turning away. Something that he did, I suppose, to help the Shah, but had the effect of overthrowing the Shah, was that he allowed the Shah to come to the United States to get cancer treatment. And that really, really kind of fanned the flames of the Shiite fundamentalists who believed that the Shah would go to America and it would allow him to seek refuge and regain his power. And that's when all hell broke loose and the Ayatollah returned to power. When the Ayatollah returned to power, of course, we all know that part of the disastrous consequences was that many Shiites stormed the U.S. Embassy and took nearly 70 Americans who were working in the embassy as hostages. The irony is that without Carter, these individuals would not have been able to be in power in the first place. They were taking these hostages as kind of a middle finger to Carter, but the whole reason that they were able to be in such a position of power is arguably because Carter turned on the Shah. But nevertheless, for 444 days, which Walter Cronkite chronicled every single day on his news program, these American citizens were held hostage. Now, Iran did something pretty politically controversial and, dare I say, savvy. They early on into the hostage crisis released female and African American hostages. I don't know how many people know this, but they were trying to do it essentially to, in their view, expose the hypocrisy of the United States. This is a big weapon that was wielded by the Islamic Republic, by China, by the Soviet Union, now Russia. They always try to make America look no different than they are. They try to say, America is this harbinger of freedom and of equality and treating everybody the same and with respect. But look at the way that they treat women, or look at the way that they treat African Americans. For instance, in World War II, it was a huge source of publicity among our adversaries that we had segregated armed forces. The civil rights era in the United States was relentlessly televised and discussed by our adversaries. And so they released female and African American hostages essentially to give the impression that they were treating minority Americans better than America treated minority Americans. Let's look at a video of this Iranian hostage crisis, which plagued the Carter presidency and really tainted his legacy.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. 2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, had taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since. This morning, for the first time since the hostages were put under lock and key, one of the captives, blindfolded, was brought out into the open.
He is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché.
He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him. Eventually, he was led back to join the other captives who have been kept out of sight.
It's amazing to watch. I mean, can you imagine now? I mean, we do have a hostage crisis. May we not forget, in Israel, there are now, I believe, 7 or 8 American citizens still being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But can you imagine if we had something like this? Yeah, I obviously wasn't alive, or as I said, wasn't even a thought at the time. But boy, it must have been terrible for the country and especially for Carter. And, you know, to add on to that, in 1980, there was this attempted rescue by the Eagle Claw mission. That's how it's referred. And it failed. The American helicopter came and tried to help evacuate some of the hostages, and there was a sandstorm, and it got into the engines, and it collided with another aircraft, and 8 American crew members died. Carter kind of had the reputation that Biden has now, where, you know, as Dennis says, everything the left touches, it destroys. It was sort of true of Carter and Biden. 2 very different men in terms of their character, but similar in terms of their disastrous policies, that most of what they touched was destroyed. Yes, Sean.
The parallels between Carter and Biden and Reagan and Trump and the similarities are fascinating. To quote Alan Estrin, Jimmy Carter, good man, bad policies. Joe Biden, bad man, horrible policies.
Exactly.
And what I added was Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer. Joe Biden, peanut for brains.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Joe Biden would love to have you believe that he was a peanut farmer. Another thing, you know, alongside this Iranian hostage crisis was the OPEC embargo in 1979, where the OPEC would not sell oil to the United States for a while. And that led to disastrously long lines and high gas prices. And they had this system where if you had an even number license plate, you know, starting or ending with an even number, you got gas on X day. And if you had an odd number, you got it on Y day. Again, I wasn't here, but can only imagine that it was a disaster. And interestingly, on July 15th of 1979, Carter delivered what is now known as his malaise speech. And actually, if you read the text or you listen to the speech, it's a good speech. And he makes really prescient and excellent points about the American ethos that we need to embody, about the way that we have glorified and worshipped material things over our own spiritual, intellectual development. But at the time, it was really not taken well. Right after the speech, he did get a kind of boost in popularity, but over time, within weeks and months, it really was seen as condescending. It was interpreted as the president sitting there in the luxury of the Oval Office, condescending to and lecturing to Americans about how they need to, you know, stop valuing material items and stop being greedy, when the economic disaster was largely a result of Carter's policies. Let's listen to just a few seconds of that speech.
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose.
I mean, agreed. It just wasn't the time. It was deemed to be a tone-deaf speech. This next thing, as I have alluded to in the show, is probably my greatest gripe with the Carter administration, besides the turning on the Shah. And that is when President Carter acknowledged the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government of China. Oy, why did he do this? It seems like a small diplomatic measure, but it really wasn't, because it opened the doors for us to really interact with China in a way that we hadn't before. And it kind of paved the road for China to set up this, on the surface, congenial relationship with the United States. But really, as we've talked about so much on the show, under the radar, they are subverting and undermining us. So in 1949, after the Civil War in China, the Communist Party triumphed, and the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to nearby Taiwan. And really, for those 30 years, the United States did not recognize the PRC as the legitimate government of China because, Mao Zedong was one of the most brutal, terrible dictators in the history of the world, killing 50 million plus Chinese people, subjecting them to famine and enslavement, terrible, terrible work conditions. The one-child policy was established under Deng Xiaoping just at the beginning of Carter's presidency. I mean, China was no great place to recognize. The People's Republic of China was no great entity to recognize. And we, by recognizing them, what we did was we gave the seat in the United States Security Council to the People's Republic of China instead of to the Nationalist Party in Taiwan. And that has really cemented the legitimacy of the PRC, and it has not insignificantly contributed to the position of someone like Xi Jinping today, who as recently as yesterday said that the reunification of the motherland, i.e. Taiwan with China, must be achieved. So let's watch that, again, I deem, disastrous moment of Carter's recognition.
The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China.
That last line is so damning, that Taiwan is part of China. That really, as I said, emboldened the Chinese Communist Party to go forth with their campaign to invade Taiwan, which we hope will not be a story that we reflect on in a year from now as one of the main ones in 2025. Just to quickly go through a few more. I mean, my gosh, blunder after blunder. Jimmy Carter also gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. Why? Why? We built the Panama Canal. We, with our taxpayer money and our American workers in the early 1900s under Teddy Roosevelt, built that. And we hugely contributed to global trade. And we just gave it back to Panama, really? Another thing that happened was that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Now, of course, people would be right to say, my gosh, it's unfair to blame that on Carter, but we see a similar parallel, as Sean was saying, between President Biden and President Carter. If a stronger, more respected U.S. president was in power over the past 4 years, we may not have seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Hamas's assault on Israel. Similarly, had a stronger U.S. president been in power during the time of Carter, we may not have seen the Soviets invade Afghanistan. I don't think that would have happened had President Reagan, for instance, been in power during that time. And Carter, in turn, boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. After that, the Soviets boycotted the Olympics here in Los Angeles. But we can kind of see, and it's a real lesson in foreign policy, the domino effect, to use a term that is usually stated in another context. We see it here, where if the Russians hadn't invaded Afghanistan, Afghanistan probably would not have turned into such a failed, terrible state that it became. In turn, the Taliban probably wouldn't have had such freedom to take over and take advantage of that failed state. Then Al-Qaeda would not have been given a safe haven in Afghanistan. And then perhaps 9/11 wouldn't have happened. And then perhaps our subsequent invasion of Afghanistan wouldn't have happened. Of course, counterfactuals in history are tricky business. We could never know any of these things for sure. But what it does prove is that one instance of incompetence compounds on another. And the dominoes get rolling where these things metastasize. Yeah, go on, John.
You're speaking of China and the Panama Canal, and it was seen as a nice thing that Jimmy Carter gave the Panama Canal back to the Panamanian government. But it's biting us in the butt now. You hear Trump about taking the Panama Canal back, and one could argue, aside from the lack of rain, which has caused problems down there for the water, you imagine what things would be like if China were in charge of that?
Well, that's to your point. I mean,
trade route.
They kind of are.
They're in the lead to build another canal, and we can't have that.
Yep.
You may not like America being dominant, but we are more benevolent, and certainly we could be in for a ton of trouble if we don't take care of this Panama Canal situation.
And people who don't like America being dominant, well, hello, we built the Panama Canal. It's not that we're just sailing in there and going, hey, we want to take control of this. This was our taxpayer money, our hard work. We should have control over it. And then a final thing that is not typically associated with President Carter. And by the way, I'm leaving off the Camp David Accords because that's just so complicated and so many people have so many opinions about that. So forgive me, I'm gonna push that one to the side for a minute, though President Carter was the first president to call Israel an apartheid state. Another example of something in his presidency not aging very well. But a final thing that I'll tell you is that it was under President Carter that the Department of Education was founded. And that is a pretty significant thing. And the reason that the DOE was founded under Carter is because the teachers' unions, the National Educators Association, the largest teachers' union in the United States, agreed to a quid pro quo. We will back you in the 1978 presidential election if you establish a federal agency, which can help us get more power. And we see that the Department of Education, a la the wise words from President Trump, is really an overbloated bureaucratic agency, which of course does have some important functions. Of course, there needs to be some level of federal oversight of education and taxpayer allocation to schools. But it employs 4,400 employees. It has a budget of $236 billion, according to the numbers back in 2022. And it has largely become a middleman between the federal government's taxpayer money and the school districts. Instead of the money going straight to the school district, it's kind of trickled through and soaked up by that huge Department of Education and many of the bureaucrats who work there. And in turn, it's not going to our kids. So hopefully there will be a effort to dismantle the Department of Education or to severely de-bloat it and cut it from being too bureaucratic. And hopefully we can chart a path forward where that thing that was established under Carter can actually serve American school children.
Look at the results.
Oh my God,
Proof
so
is
dismal.
in the pudding.
Oh, of course.
Our education system is a joke.
Less than
I bet you can trace it back and watch the decline.
Oh, of course.
Of education in this country from the time that the DOE was created.
Did you know that less than a third of 8th graders in the United States can read at grade levels? Only 25%, sorry, when I say that, I mean meet proficiency standards at grade levels. Less than a third of 8th graders, 25% of 8th graders meet proficiency standards in math. Yeah. Thanks, Carter.
Speaking of reading, because I know you're very intelligent, I don't do this to correct you, but I know how much you love the pronunciation guy on the internet. That's the only reason I'm doing this. How did you pronounce that city in Washington State?
You know what's so funny, Sean? When I said it, I looked over and I saw a little twinkle in your eye, and I knew you were going to get me on it. Spokane?
Spokane. Phonetically, you're correct, but you're dead wrong.
How do you go about pronouncing the name of this city? Spokane.
Oh.
Spokane.
How do you go about pronouncing the name? Yeah. Thank you, Sean. I am so happy that I know that. You know, let's end on a positive note with Carter, because he really was a decent man, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. He built, after his presidency, over 4,000 homes through Habitat for Humanity. That's as many employees as the Department of Education he founded. So he made up for it. And let's put up a picture. Even in his final days on this earth, he was always committed to helping other people. And in fact, in 2002, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his spectacular work building homes for people who are unhoused, as the woke would say. Thank you all so much for joining me this episode and this year. It is such a joy to be able to interact with you. And I so cherish your input. I love hearing from you at julie@julie-hartman.com. Thank you to everyone in the producer's dungeon, especially Sean McConnell, who never gets enough credit for all of the work that he does behind the scenes. But we love you. We appreciate you so much, all of you in there, and especially to all of you listeners.
Happy New Year, Jules.
Oh, thank you. And to all of you.
2025 bring us health for Dennis Prager.
Absolutely. Amen. A great note to end on. I'll see you next year. Bye, everyone.